Hi guys, today I just want to discuss with you some of my thoughts on basic equipment recommendations and just talk about, I guess really, some suggestions on what blades, what type of inverted rubbers or long pips or anti-spin rubbers suit particular styles of play, and really just kind of give you what I've learnt, I guess, over the years about it and my particular thoughts on the subject, and just share that with you. So, starting, I guess, with the discussion on particular long pips and anti-spin type rubbers. What I'll do is I'll break it into, I guess, the different kind of categories, starting with close to the table play, and then I'll talk about more of the long range defender types. So, for all of you close to the table players, although there's I guess a wide spectrum of different styles of play, it's not as easy as just saying, well, there's defensive close to the table players and there's aggressive close to the table players. It's not quite as simple as that. There's many different in-between spots depending on how exactly you use the rubbers, whether you twiddle, whether you're more aggressive with your forehand or your backhand, or you push with both sides, or there's lots of different blendings along the way. But to simplify things a lot, which is what I'm just trying to do here, basically I think if you're a defensive close to the table player, you'll generally benefit from using probably a long pip with either no sponge or very thin sponge. Reason being, as a defensive long combination bat player, what you're looking to do is probably get the most spin reversal you can from the rubber, get the maximum effect, I guess, from it, and you don't necessarily want a lot of pace off the rubber because you're looking to absorb your opponent's pace, you're looking to slow the point down, probably to keep the ball short on the table, stop your opponent getting a big swing in. So in those sort of cases, it's usually you're looking at either no sponge or a very thin sponge, say in the 0.5 type variety. Now there'll always be exceptions to the rule, but again, it's just a generalisation. In terms of the actual pips themselves, again, I would be suggesting that for most players who want to play defensively up close to the table, probably a stiffer and a less grippy pip. I guess the classic used to be basically go for frictionless and go for the frictionless close to the table that allowed you to keep the ball very short and do it. Now, frictionless is no longer an option, obviously, now that the ITTF have brought in those minimum friction requirements. So you'd probably be looking for something that gets as close to that limit as possible or mimics the effect as much as possible. So on the spectrum, there's so many pips out there to choose from now, but some of the I think some of the TT Master long pips, or the Hallmark long pips, or I think now the 7, I don't know if that's how you pronounce them now, but it's the 7 with SE and then a 7 and then EN. They seem to be generally thought of as having fairly close to frictionless effect. So it's based on the choice of the style. I'm assuming here that you're looking to have those effects of absorbing pace, keeping the ball short, maximum spin continuation and wobbly type effect. In the anti-spin version, if you're not looking for long pips, if you're an anti-spin player, defensive playing close to the table, I would probably go with a slipperier, firmer type of anti-spin. What comes to mind would be something like Shriver Anti. Another one that comes to mind would be there's a Dr. Nabauer type of anti-spin that I saw a couple of years ago. One of my local players was using it, and what it is, it's on a sponge. It's an inverted anti-spin obviously, but it's on a sponge. The sponge seemed fairly normal, but the top sheet was absolutely rock hard. It was like a piece of wood. And so what he got was basically a very good spin reversal from it. Obviously, you couldn't generate anything with it, but it really was, in terms of anti-spin, it was a very, kept the spin going very, very well. So something that's probably slipperier and harder would be better for a defensive close to the table player, for the same reasons. What would I recommend over anti-spin or long pips? In general, for most situations, I usually recommend long pips because of the extra variation. The one exception that I would really make, where I would say favour anti-spin over long pips, would be when we start talking about the more aggressive close to the table players, and I'll come to that in a second. But it doesn't mean that you can't play defensively close to the table with anti-spin. I'm sure you can, and I'm sure lots of people do successfully. It's just for the average person, without knowing anything else about your style, I would usually go and say go with the long pips instead. You'll get more advantages, more variation. So it's a general rule of thumb. It has to be taken in context for your own style, obviously. Now, speaking of the more aggressive close to the table players, again, when we're talking about the long pips type of thing, I'd be starting to look, you'd be suggesting a sponge in probably 1 mil sponge, 1.5. If you're very adventurous with your long pips, you might even go up to a 1.9 or a 2 mil sponge and really try and hit hard with the long pips. I know of certain people who do that, and with a reasonable amount of success, considering they're trying to hit with long pips. And if they had more practice, they'd probably do a lot better with it. But yeah, so I'd probably be looking at probably the 1 to 1.5 for most people. And if you've got a little bit more time to train, or you're very much aggressive, you might want to look at thicker than 1.5 sponge even. The actual type of long pips you'd be going, I'd be recommending a more flexible long pip that bends more and also that is grippier, softer, so that it allows you to, when trying to top spin the ball or chop the ball, you get more bend of the pips and can generate a little bit more spin of your own. And that would be my thinking behind it. What types? Well, there's again millions to choose from. You could go with something like the TSP Curl P1R. That's generally known as a chopper's rubber. Someone like Juicy Hook uses it. But it could be used very successfully. It's bendy enough for it. Hallmark Frustration springs to mind. I know one of my ex-students uses that quite successfully. Even a medium pip, such as the Curl P2 that I used to use, that was a very good close to the table pip that allowed you to hit very well, push close to the table very well, block quite well with it. Didn't have a lot of wobble, but certainly did allow good all-round play. So medium pips could be worth considering there as well. Even something along the lines of the possibly the faint long 3. There are lots out there. It's not important. It's not important for me to say use this one or use that particular one. Use what feels comfortable, but you're looking for those sort of characteristics in the long pip. Now, if you're an anti-spin user, this is one of the cases, or one of the rare cases, where I tend to recommend an anti-spin over a long pip. And it's the case where you really do want to play a lot of aggressive hitting with the junk rubber, with the alternative rubber. In that case, an anti-spin can sometimes be a better choice. You won't have quite the same variation that a long pip will have, but you'll have a lot more control. And usually the throw, the lifting of the ball, is better with the anti-spin than the long pip. And in those sort of cases, I'd recommend something more like the Yasaka Anti-Power, which I'm familiar with. Butterfly used to have one called, I think, Absorber, back in 20 years ago, which again, the idea was that it was not quite as dead as Shriver Anti, and allowed you to play a little bit more with it. Any of those sort of anti-spins that aren't dead bouncing but have a little spring in the sponge and a little bit of flexibility in the top sheet will allow you to generate a little bit of spin of your own and just make it that much more easier to vary hitting with the anti-spin and hitting with the inverted rubber. And in those cases when you're in a very aggressive player who prefers to aggressively topspin and twiddle rather than push a lot with the anti close to the table, you may be better served with an anti-spin than a long pip. Again, there will be exceptions, and I'm fairly broadly generalising here, but that would be my particular recommendation in that case. So, yeah, if you're a very aggressive player looking to dominate by constantly pressuring your opponent with top spinning and twiddling from both wings, an anti-spin may actually be a better choice than a long pimple. However, that doesn't mean you can't do it with long pips. You may need a little bit more practice, and the control won't be there. You will get more probably effects from the long pip though. So it's not to say one or the other, just be aware that certain styles will match better to certain rubbers. Okay, now for long range defenders, such as myself, the type of rubber we're talking about here traditionally has always been, people will say, go with a flexible pip that's reasonably grippy, use it on a 0.5 to 1 mil sponge, and that's always been kind of end of story. Now, I've been using myself for the last couple of years, I've been using that type of long pip. I've been using Stiga Destroyer, which is flexible, quite grippy, but I've been using it with no sponge. And to be perfectly honest, I can't find any real downside to it. Possibly when you're trying to hit with the close to the table, when you're trying to be aggressive with the long pip, you don't have quite the pace. But for chopping purposes, it chops perfectly well, as I can tell, compared to chopping with sponge. I really don't see a downside to it. Now again, that's just me. So in this case, I may be the exception. And for most of you out there, I would say, well, go with something like Stiga Destroyer, which is very good to control. If you're a little bit more advanced and a little bit more wanting to generate the backspin, try the TSP Curl P1R. It's kind of the gold standard, I guess, of defensive chopping rubbers. It's known for its big production of backspin. It can be a little bit harder to control than something like Stiga Destroyer or other rubbers. Again, it's like anything. Basically, when I was moving from my medium pip, my TSP Curl P2, when that went out of production temporarily and I had to go find another rubber, I tried the Destroyer in Ox, I tried TSP Curl P1R in Ox, put them both on my bat, fired up my robot onto a heavy topspin, chopped with them both for half an hour, and I just found the Stiga Destroyer a little bit easier to control than the TSP Curl. So I went with the TSP, I went with the Stiga Destroyer, and haven't bothered with the TSP Curl since. However, if you look on my site in the free videos, you'll see there's some videos of Colin Bowler, sorry, I should say, playing in the WA State Final from 2008. He actually got my sheet of TSP Curl P1R. I gave him it because I did not want it. He put it on his bat and he plays fantastically well, and he can't believe how great it feels. So he can't say enough about it, how good it is using it in Ox. And he's always used, like me, always used it with sponge, used a long pip with sponge. So don't get too caught up in that. But for starting purposes, yeah, if you're a long range defender, go with probably the 1 mil sponge. Go with something like Stiga Destroyer is a good starting point. Anything just a well-respected, reasonably grippy, flexible long pip. Faint long 2, faint long 3, obviously the TSP Curl P1R, well known. there's others out there. It's really the characteristics more than the brand name. I think the Neptune, you know, is also seen some of my people that I know are using that quite successfully. The Osaka C7s, the Double Fish 1615s, all of these can be used, and you may not like each individual one, but they're all quite good rubbers for that kind of purpose. Antispin, yeah, you can use Antispin for long range defending. I wouldn't personally recommend it myself. You don't get quite the spin variation that you will get with a long pip, and yeah, the benefits just aren't quite there. So although it can be done, and I'm sure there's somebody out there doing it very well with an anti-spin, for most people the long pips for long range defending are going to be a better option. If you are going to use the anti-spin, again, I would probably say go with, well, the sponge is usually pretty dead on anti-spin, but I would be going with something more like the Osaka Anti-Power than the Shriver Anti. Something with a little bit of grip, a little bit of pace of the sponge, rather than completely dead. Just because it gives you a little bit more chance to vary than having a completely dead anti-spin that basically puts back whatever your opponent gives you. Because as a defender, from that far away from the table, if you're predictable and your opponent knows and he can see you've used the anti-spin from that far back, you'll probably have a fairly good read of what's going on, and that can be troublesome. Closer to the table, things are happening much faster, the twiddling is more effective, and it can be a lot tougher on your opponent. So yeah, for long range defending, flexible, grippy long pips, try a 1mm sponge. If you think it's too slow, go up to 1.5. If you think you would rather, you know, if it's not bad but you're thinking I want even more control, try 0.5 or even try it in the no sponge version. And I certainly have had no problems. The usual thing is lack of power, people say. And I find I have no problems chopping from way back to the table with Ox. It's quite fast enough, and you may find the same. So don't go with just what everybody says. Feel free to test it out yourself on those ones. Now, those are just, I guess, generalisations. You have to keep in mind your own particular style, your own quirks, your own strengths and weaknesses, and be willing to change things a little bit according to how you play. For example, if you're a defensive close to the table player, well, let's say you're an aggressive close to the table player, but you never use the the long pip or anti-slide, you never use it to hit with. You only ever use it to push the ball around and set up your inverted side. Well, you don't need the anti-spin to allow you to hit with then, so probably long pips are a better option. So there's things to consider that you should keep in mind in these cases and adjust it to your particular style. Or if you're not sure, find me off a question and I'll give you my thoughts on your particular style and what might suit you in particular. Now, talking about inverted rubber, the inverted stuff, well, you know, there's thousands of different inverted rubbers, there's thousands of different ways to use them. So again, I'm going to give you some sweeping generalisations to take on board. The more defensive you play with the inverted rubber, the more defensive your style, the more defensive the way you use it, probably the thinner the sponge you're looking for, also the less sticky, the less tacky the top sheet. And by that I mean the Chinese type of sticky rubbers that you put them on the ball and the ball stays with the rubber. That kind of sticky. I don't recommend having that sort of sticky rubber if you're a very defensive player. Sure, you'll get maybe a tiny little bit of extra spin with your pushes, but the problem is the reaction. It grips when your opponent spins at you. It reacts so hard on your racket, it makes it very hard to control the ball. And you don't want that as a very defensive player. You want excellent control. So instead of the sticky Friendship 729s, the sticky G888s, the Hurricanes and all of that stuff, I would recommend going with the Japanese, European type rubbers. Go with the tackiness chops. Go with, if you're more aggressive, maybe the Tachyfire drives. The Dr. Neubauer Domination was a favourite of mine before I scaled back to something a little bit slower. But if you find that you're a very, an all-round player, the Domination in 1.5 was a very, very nice rubber, a very nice feel to it. It's grippy without being sticky, has good pace, and really the only thing I found with it is in the 1.5 version when I'm trying to really load up the backspin, it was just a little bit lacking in control for that. And rather than, I could have gone down to the 1.2 version of it, but I thought, well, I might as well go back to the slowest of the slow, so I went to tackiness chop 1.1 mil, which is really the bottom of the spectrum, because I figured if I go to the bottom and it's too slow, it's then just a matter of stepping up, rather than being in the middle and stepping a little bit. I thought I might as well try going right to the bottom and seeing it. And as it happened, I quite like my tackiness chop in 1.1 mil, and I'm perfectly happy with that at the moment myself. So the more defensive you are, the thinner the sponge. Go with something that's not sticky, so go with probably a Japanese or European. The tensor rubbers, yeah, I used to use Tango Defensive, which is a tensor defensive rubber. I liked it. I was using it on the wrong blade. I was using it on a T-Mobile Spirit, which is way too fast in hindsight. And I would have liked it even more if I was using it on my current blade, which is the Matsushita Pro Special. I haven't actually tried it on a Matsushita Pro Special because I went from the Tango Defensive to the Domination, and from there I changed the blade afterwards. So I've never given it a try on the really slow rubber. But I would think even the Domination is supposed to be a tensor type rubber, and that feels quite good. So yeah, you can go with a tensor. Just if you're defensively minded, don't go with anything thicker than 1.5, or you're going to find problems with your control. If you're more aggressive, you can start to move up the scale. You can go to thicker rubber, 1.5. Whether you want to go to 1.9, whether you want to go to 2.1, if you're an aggressive player who never pushes with the inverted or doesn't chop with the inverted, then 2.1, max type style rubbers may be an option. If you're looking to play an all-round game of sometimes pushing, sometimes looping, sometimes chopping, then probably something more in the range of the 1.5 to 1.9 makes sense. Simply because it gives you a little bit more of control in all situations. And again, go with something in 1.5. If it's got good pushing but not quite enough zip when attacking, there's nothing to say you're not allowed to move up to 1.7 or 1.9. It's just a matter of making fine adjustments. The main thing is don't get locked into unthinkingly saying, I'm very aggressive, I must use 2.1. Or I'm defensively playing an all-round game, defence and attack, therefore I must use 1.5. There's no must about it. It's finding what works best for you. And that may be not a 1.5, it may be a 1.7. If you have very, very good control of your pushing game, you can afford to go to a thicker rubber and lose a little bit of control when you push and get a bit more zip on your attack because your pushing technique is so good. If your pushing technique is really, really poor, you may need to go to a thinner rubber. And it's individual characteristics. So bear that in mind. Always keep in mind there's always a trade-off. There's no rubber that I've ever found or heard of that does everything perfectly. So no matter what you choose, there's going to be some trade-off. There's going to be some things it does well. There's going to be some things it doesn't do so well. Okay? And it's up to you to match that the rubber's characteristics to your game and find the right mix. So generally what we're saying is the more defensive you are, the thinner the sponge, avoid the sticky stuff. Not avoid tensors, but don't go with the thick tensors. If you're more aggressive with the rubber, you can go to thicker, you can go to those tensors, the speed glue replacement rubbers if need be. You can go with this really sticky top sheets that allow that little bit of extra generation of spin but sacrifice some control, because if you're only ever using your inverted to attack and not push much, you don't need that extra control when pushing. So it's a matter of matching the rubber to suit the game that you play. Now let's just talk a little bit about the blades. To keep it simple, I guess the more defensive you are with the blade, with your style, probably the more slower the blade you want with the more control. The more aggressive you are, the faster the blade can be. It doesn't have to be, but definitely the faster the potential is there to go to a faster blade. Now, as someone who has in the past made the mistake of trying to play a defensive game with a very aggressive blade, I would say be very, very objective about the style you actually play. Okay? Get some video of yourself, if possible, playing people around your level or a little bit better than you. Not people who are much worse than you. You don't want that. You want people who are on your level or a bit better. People who are making you work very hard and play a style where you're under pressure. Okay? So you can see what actually you use when under pressure. Take a look at that video or get people to look at you while you're playing and analyse how you're playing. Because what you need a blade that suits that. Okay, that suits that style. When I was using the very, very fast T-Mobile Spirit blade with defensive rubbers, what I found is, yes, it was great for when I was playing a lower level player and I had time to dominate with my top spin and do things. But against the top level Australian players, it wasn't the right mix, because there I wasn't attacking first very often. I was chopping and pushing, and trying to do that, take someone like William Hensel's power loop with a T-Mobile Spirit blade and control the ball, let alone hope to be able to vary the spin on the ball. It just wasn't happening. It was a silly, in hindsight, a very, very silly decision to make. And the mistake I made was that I had bought 3 of those blades, which weren't cheap back when I was attacking, and I didn't want to say, look, I've just spent $450 on blades and now I've got to go off and find 3 defensive blades. And I lived with that for a year or two because I was too stupid to say, well look, it doesn't matter what I spent on those blades, they're not the right blades for my style. So it just goes to show it doesn't matter how long you've been playing, you can still make really dumb decisions. So having moved to now a blade that is actually suited to my style, what I'm finding is I'm playing a lot better with it. Go figure. So you need to be aware of what style you really play. That will allow you to choose a blade that suits your style and how one that really does work. What's more important, blades or rubbers? Well, it's the combination that's really important, because a rubber that feels good on one blade may feel not so good on another. But if I had to pick what's more important, I'd probably say it's more important to get the blade feel right. And once you've got a blade that you're comfortable with, you can mix and match with different rubbers, different sponge thicknesses, different models of the rubber even, between brands, and just tweak the rubbers a little bit once you know roughly what you're after. So I'd rather get my blade sorted first and then modify my rubbers for the right feel. But you don't have to do it that way, that's just what I personally would recommend. What types of blade we're talking about here? Well, for myself, who's a fairly defensive player who counterattacks, I'm using the Matsushita Pro Special from Butterfly, which is a willow and carbon arrowite blade. So it's still a carbon blade. So it's not super slow, but it's not the fastest blade out there. It's a good medium speed blade. Very, very nice control. I'm very, very happy with it. If I wasn't using this, I would probably be trying something like the Matsushita Pro, which is a little bit slower again, or one of the Stiga defensive blades, something along that line, because I'm looking for the extra control. For a close to the table player who's looking to play defensively, again a good defensive blade such as the Matsushita Pro, Stiga defensive, some of the Donic defensive, any good brand name defensive to all-round blade would probably do a fairly good job. And as you get more aggressive, you'll start looking from the all-round blades up until some of the more faster aggressive. And if you're an aggressive player who's really just using the anti-spin or the long pips to set up the big forehand put away, you may be using a very aggressive blade. And in those situations, something like the T-Mobile Spirit may be suitable for you. If I was playing close to the table with an anti-spin and twiddling with the anti-spin and playing, the T-Mobile Spirit may be a much better choice for me. But for my current style, it's way too fast. It's not a chopping bat. Only took me 3 years to work that out. So, okay. If you're on, in terms of finding the right actual blade and rubber, again, if you're on a tight budget, blades are more expensive usually than rubbers, so find the blade first, adjust the rubbers. If you're on a tight budget, don't be ashamed to go with some of the Chinese long pips and the Chinese rubbers. The quality is pretty good these days. I mean, 10 years ago, the only decent Chinese stuff was probably the old Friendship 729. All the rest was kind of a bit dodgy. Nowadays, it's all pretty good, and the price is right. So, when you're buying them for $10 a sheet, you can afford to try a few different variations. If you're trying something like Bryce for $70 a sheet, you can't afford to try too many of those. So if you buy it, you're usually stuck with it. So, yeah, some of the cheaper stuff, the Chinese stuff, is quite worthwhile checking out. Or, if you're something like me, go with something that's, say in this case, if this tackiness chop 1.1 had been way too slow, I may have said, okay, well, I'll try it in the 1.5. Or if it's way too slow and I don't like it at all, I'll go to the domination in 1.2 and see what that feels like. If that's too slow, I'll step up to the 1.5. So it's not a matter of trying every rubber under the sun. It's a matter of saying, okay, this rubber feels good, not so good, what's not so great about it, can I find something that fixes that? More speed, better control. Can I get that from changing the sponge thickness first? And if you can, try that first before changing the actual brand of the rubber. So the idea is to try and zero in on something that feels pretty good, not something that feels perfect, because you'll probably never find something that feels perfect anyway. And if you're playing and improving, in 6 months' time, your game will probably be a little bit different, as you've improved, and what felt perfect 6 months ago will no longer be perfect for you anyway. So spending that 6 months searching for the perfect paddle is a waste of time. Go for pretty good, and if it's pretty good, stay with that for the next year and practice, and then when you come to the beginning of your next season, maybe try a different blade, try a friend's blade, try a couple of different rubbers, try a different long pip that you've read about that people say are good, try a different inverted, just feel it out. If you really love it, stay with it. If you don't like it so much, go back to your favourite and spend another year. I actually find with my rubbers, my long pips and my inverteds, over the last 6 or 7 years, I've probably used for defensive purposes 3 rubbers. Tango defensive, I've used Dr. Nabauer domination, I've used the tackiness chop. For my long pip side, I was using TSP Curl P2. That got discontinued. I tried in the off season, I tried the Destroyer and I tried the TSP Curl P1R, chose the Destroyer, and 2 or 3 years later I'm still using the Destroyer. I've tried in the off season, gave the Dayway 388D1, I think it is. I gave that a quick go. Yeah, you know, I didn't mind it, but it didn't set me on fire, so I stuck with my Destroyer. Couldn't be bothered changing it. And the other benefit of that is, by not chopping and changing every couple of months, you get used to what bat angle under pressure, what swing speed and what bat angle to hold your bat at. And for someone who's using a combination bat, that's almost probably doubly important, because you've got to get reactions quickly with the inverted side and with the long pip or the anti-spin side. You don't want to have to be consciously thinking about, okay, I'm now using the Curl P1, therefore I've got to hold it there. Whereas if I'm using the Destroyer, I hold it there. You know, you haven't got time to think about that during a match. And when someone just whacks it at you, you just got to put the bat there. No, you'll get the bat angle wrong, quite likely. So by sticking most of the time to the same rubbers, and then just trying them in the off season, and if you don't like it within a day or two, going back to your normal stuff, that will give you a continuity in terms of your bat angles, your swing speed. You won't have to think about it, it will be instinctual. And all those pressure points, you'll have the right bat angle. And it adds up over time. You know, you don't want to be consciously thinking during the game about what angle to hold your bat at, about how fast your rubber is compared to what you're used to. You know, that's not what you want to do. You want to be thinking about your opponent or about your tactics, not about the mechanics. That's not where your head wants to be at. Okay, so find something that's pretty good, stick with that for a year, try a couple of things in the off season, pick one, stick with it for another year. Even if you don't do anything else that I tell you, if you can stick to that, you're going to get some benefit from that anyway. So remember, pretty good is what you're looking for, not perfect. The last thing I would probably say is, I think I briefly touched on this before and I'll just mention it again, is be aware of the bat you're looking for is the bat that suits the style you play against people of your level or people that are better than you or slightly better than you, that are putting you under pressure. Okay? You've got to be using the bat that suits that style, not the bat that allows you to dominate somebody who's 2 levels below you. That's not the right bat for you. And it's not your dream bat that when you hit the big time, 10 years from now, the style playing, you know, like Ju or like Chen Wexing or whatever, it's not the bat that you're using then either. It's the bat that suits you right now in the next 6 months to a year. So be realistic. There's no point saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to play this modern defensive game where I'm going to chop like hell on the backhand and I'll run around and top spin forehand winners. You know, if you're 40 pounds overweight, you've got bad knees and your forehand technique is dodgy, well, you know, you're just kidding yourself. You know, so be aware of what you really are, what level you're at, what you really do against your current peer group, and pick a bat that suits that, and then slowly work to improve the game. And you'll find that will be a lot better recommendation for you than picking something for 5 years down the track, because you may not ever get there. You may get frustrated and give up if you're using the wrong equipment. And as someone who in the past has used the wrong equipment for his particular style because he had visions of himself playing in a style that really doesn't suit the way I really do play against my peer group, I can tell you it's a really stupid feeling to wake up a few years later and say, oh my God, you know, that was really, really dumb. Why did I do that? On the other hand, if I can share it with you guys and you can avoid making the same mistake, then at least somebody benefits. And by the same token, I'm using now equipment that suits my style, and I'm playing better than ever, simply because I'm realistic about what I really can do, what I really do, and I'm picking equipment that actually allows me to do that better. And so I'm playing a better brand of table tennis. Simple as that. So, in a nutshell, let's just go back really over it. What I've been talking about here is really just the fact that, okay, what I'm giving you here is just some generalisations, okay? They are sweeping, broad brushstrokes on what to choose versus what not to choose. It doesn't mean that you have to follow me every word that I say slavishly. What you should do is go, well, okay, this is what Greg is saying, this is why he's saying it. Does it apply to me? You know, do I fit that broad generalisation? Do I do something a little bit different that justifies me using a slightly different blade or a slightly different long pip or anti-spin? And if you do, then that's great. Go ahead. As long as you're doing it for intelligent reasons that suit your style, then I think you're on the right track. It's when you blindly follow somebody else's advice, or you get locked into certain assumptions of your own that you just don't re-examine and just assume are true, that sometimes you can get down the wrong path. So have another think about your style. If possible, get some video, get someone to analyse it when you're playing somebody else. Take a close look at what you really do. Think about whether what you're really doing is that being helped by your current equipment, and if it is, great. If not, go on the search for something that's going to actually help you play your style better. And if you want to find me an email or show me send me a video so that I can give you some thoughts, I'm more than happy to weigh in. And for goodness sake, use stuff that helps you, not hurt you, and certainly not there for an ego boost. Don't try and use the fastest blade because it's the most expensive, or it looks the coolest, or your coach uses it and tells you you have to use it. If you don't like it and it's not helping your game, for goodness sake, find something that does. So again, I hope that's my thoughts on basic equipment. My basic equipment recommendations. I hope they've been of some value. If there's anything you want me to clarify or anything you want to ask, fire away, and I'll get right back to you. So thanks for listening.